Hello and welcome to our France 24 interview. Our guest is Christine Lagarde, who's Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Hello, Christine Lagarde, and thank you for being with us here in Marrakech.
Hello.
You were in Davos recently, where you gave us forecasts for growth for the world at 3.9% from 2018. So growth is moving back up again. But will that growth benefit to all countries in the world, and particularly for the Arab countries?
Yes, we published our growth forecasts, as we usually do in January. We did it during the Davos week. And the forecasts are fairly good. For 2018 and for 2019, growth is forecasted at 3.9% compared to 3.7% the previous year. The second piece of good news is that this growth is generated by more than 120 countries, which represent roughly three-quarters of the world economy. What that means is that it's not just a few emerging markets or a few developed countries, but rather that it is spread throughout the planet. However, it does not concern all of the countries. 120 is a vast majority, but it is not all of the countries. In the Middle East and North Africa, and even more so in sub-Saharan Africa, the growth rates are still much lower than they were before the crisis. If you look at the Middle East and North Africa, it was roughly 5.6%, and now we will just barely reach 3.5% for the whole set of countries in that area, which is better than the 2017 numbers. And therefore, the tendency is positive, but it's lower than what would be necessary in order to meet the needs in terms of employment, for example, in the region. And this is really one of the most difficult numbers. We still have at least 25% unemployment amongst young people. In some countries, it goes as high as 30%. And in the next few years, every year, we will have 5 million young people coming onto the job market looking for work. And therefore, we really need to concentrate on growth potential, on improving productivity, and on emphasizing sectors that will create jobs.
So you're talking about solutions, and particularly for Arab countries. And since we're here in Marrakech, what are the solutions that have emerged from the discussions?
We had a very interesting conference because it brought people together from the public sector. We, of course, had the head of the Moroccan government, the Tunisian prime minister, a number of finance ministers who participated, the governors of the central banks. So we had people from macroeconomics, financial stability, and also representatives of the private sector, as well as many young people who are young scholars or young startuppers who've just begun their businesses. There's a number of main areas where we really need to act. We've heard clearly that there needs to be more transparency, less corruption, and this is systematic throughout the countries. We also heard that we need more opportunities, both for young people, for women, and also for refugees. We heard that new technologies, in particular, must be used and valued in order to create jobs and stimulate the economy. Of course, there's nothing all that new about all this. We were able to imagine such solutions. But the interesting thing is everyone seems to agree now that it's time to implement all of this. It's not just a question of governments or parliaments. It's also something that the private sector needs to be involved in. We can no longer continue meeting the need for more jobs by creating additional jobs in the civil service. That was what we used to do in the past. It worked for a certain amount of time, but it is not going to meet the needs of today's youth.
And speaking of reforms in some of these countries, let's look at Tunisia and Egypt that have gotten aid from the International Monetary Fund. Let's start with Tunisia, where they adopted reforms to the budget for 2018 with a tax hike, and there have been demonstrations recently against some of these measures. Do you understand that worry on the part of some Tunisians, and how can they set up reforms that would be both fair and enable deficit to be reduced?
Well, of course, we understand the concern of Tunisia and the populations in the zone, but we've also tried to anticipate and help the governments anticipate. Why is there this feeling of frustration? In fact, that was the title of the conference, Responding to Frustration, simply because there are a number of reforms which have already been started in a very courageous manner, but people don't feel the results yet, whether it's the increase in prices, very high increases in Egypt, they're now coming down. Things are stagnating now, but there's a risk as well in Tunisia. There's also been a change in the subsidies that they used to benefit from fossil energy, for example, subsidies for basic raw materials, and also they're worried about the increase in VAT, which increased by 1 percentage point in Tunisia. We're in a period of transition. We must never forget that. Reforms must accelerate, must be adopted in order to stabilize our economies and reassure investors so that companies invest once again, create jobs. This is something that we need to do together. All of the players in the Tunisian economy must understand that, yes, reforms need to continue moving forward. The appropriate measures must be taken to protect the poorest of the poor and to have a safety net. And at the same time, people need to understand that in some areas, taxes have to be paid. There shouldn't be permanent exemptions. And slowly but surely, we have to go from a system where there were subsidies for all to a targeted support system for the people who need it most. I think that a budget has been adopted recently. I'm always particularly worried just before elections because an electoral period is a period where people promise more and more. But what we need is to stay the route of a financial policy which will reassure investors and feel comfortable investing in Tunisia.
And what about Egypt? A lot of reforms have passed, and particularly regarding the exchange rate, which has been liberated, and subsidies. Have these measures started showing results?
Well, let's take a look at inflation. As we all anticipated, there was a very sharp rise in inflation when exchange rates began to float. Inflation went up to almost 30%. It's now beginning to decline significantly. We believe that in 2018, it will go down to roughly 12% and continue to decrease. So that's a sign. That's a sign that the policy is working. This drop in inflation, which of course is painful for the most exposed and the poorest, at the same time, the rate of exchange reserves has increased. The balance is better, more confidence in the economy, and there is an increase in investments in Egypt. The Egypt risk, so to speak, is more reassuring.
And to wrap it up, Christine Lagarde, since we're in Morocco, Morocco has reformed their exchange rate recently. They've made it more flexible. How do you see that? Does this go in the right direction for the International Monetary Fund?
You know, the IMF in Morocco is a very long story. It's a partnership, it's a relationship of friendship, ongoing support and dialogue. In the previous period, where it was decided to make the exchange rate more flexible in a gradual manner, there was a lot of discussion. But the decision was made by the Kingdom of Morocco in a very sovereign fashion, and clearly the markets are satisfied. They believe it was a good decision because we now see more stability, and the markets are satisfied.
Thank you very much, Christine Lagarde, for answering these questions. This brings us to the end of our France 24 interview. You can watch it over and over on our website, france24.com. Thank you.